It was a normal day at one of the country's top universities. Students filled the large lecture hall, chatting and settling into their seats. Some scrolled through their phones while others flipped through their notes. The air buzzed with energy, but no one expected anything unusual to happen. It was just another class, another lecture. The door at the back of the hall opened quietly. A man walked in, dressed casually, jeans, a jacket, nothing fancy. He chose a seat near the back, away from attention. No one looked twice. He just seemed like another student. A few moments later the professor entered, a well-respected expert in his field. He had spent years studying advanced technology and engineering. He greeted the students, placed his notes on the desk, and prepared to begin. The chatter died down as the students focused on the front of the room. The professor adjusted his glasses and started explaining the day's topic. The man in the back sat still, listening carefully. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes showed deep focus. The students were unaware. The professor was unaware. No one in that room realized that one of the most brilliant minds of the century was sitting among them. And soon he was going to ask a question that would change everything. The professor adjusted his microphone and looked at the class. "Today, we're going to dive into advanced propulsion systems," he said. His voice carried authority, the kind that comes from years of experience. The students sat up straighter, ready to take notes. Some leaned forward, eager to absorb the knowledge. Others simply prepared to get through another lecture. The man in the back remained silent. His eyes locked onto the professor. The lecture began. The professor explained the principles of modern space travel, detailing the challenges of escaping Earth's gravity. He talked about fuel efficiency, thrust power, and the physics behind long-distance space exploration. Traditional chemical rockets have their limits, he continued. Scientists are exploring new ideas, nuclear propulsion, ion thrusters, even antimatter engines. Some students scribbled notes furiously. Others nodded in agreement. The man in the back, however, wasn't writing. He was listening closely. As the professor continued, he drew diagrams on the whiteboard. Equations filled the space, each one more complex than the last. "We face a problem," the professor said. "Deep space travel requires more efficient propulsion. Right now our options are limited." He paused, scanning the room. "Any thoughts?" A few students hesitated before offering their ideas. One suggested solar sails, another mentioned fusion energy. The professor nodded, acknowledging their answers, but his expression remained thoughtful. In the back, the man remained quiet, his mind processing everything. No one knew he had already spent years working on these very problems. No one realized that the person sitting among them had founded companies trying to solve these exact challenges. The discussion continued, touching on AI-powered navigation, reusable rocket designs, and the possibility of colonizing Mars. The professor spoke passionately. He loved this subject. He had dedicated his career to studying it, but he had no idea that, soon, someone in this very room would challenge his ideas in a way he had never expected. The students remained engaged, unaware that history was about to be made in the most unexpected way, and the man in the back, he simply waited. Soon he would speak, and when he did, everything would change. As the lecture continued, students remained focused, jotting down notes, highlighting key points, and occasionally whispering among themselves. The man in the back, however, wasn't taking notes like the others. He held a pen, but he barely used it. Instead, he listened deeply. A few students sitting nearby started to notice him. Something about him felt different. He wasn't distracted. He wasn't scrolling through his phone. He wasn't struggling to keep up with the complex equations on the board. Instead, he seemed amused. Every time the professor made a statement about the limits of propulsion, the man's lips curled slightly, as if he already knew something the rest of the room didn't. At one point, the professor presented a theory on fuel efficiency in space travel. A few students nodded in agreement, accepting it as fact. But the man in the back, he tilted his head, just slightly. His eyes narrowed, his mind working through the information. A student sitting next to him noticed and glanced at him curiously. Who was this guy? Meanwhile, the professor kept talking, his energy growing as he explained the challenges of deep space exploration. NASA and private companies are working on solutions, he said. but these concepts are still in early development. For the first time, the man in the back tapped his pen against his notebook. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable. But to those who were paying attention, it felt like something was coming. Some students were starting to sense it, even if they couldn't explain why. There was something different about this quiet observer. The way he listened, the way he reacted, the way he seemed to process the information faster than anyone else in the room. But no one could have predicted what was about to happen next, because in just a few moments, this man, this unassuming student sitting in the back, was going to ask a question that would leave the entire room speechless. Even the professor, an expert in his field, wouldn't know how to respond. And in that moment, everything would change. The lecture had been going on for nearly an hour. The professor was in his element, explaining the complexities of deep space propulsion. The students were engaged, some taking notes, others simply absorbing the knowledge. Then, the moment arrived. The professor paused and looked at the room. "All right," he said, "any questions?" A few hands went up. One student asked about the efficiency of ion thrusters. Another inquired about the future of nuclear propulsion. The professor answered each question smoothly, his expertise shining through. Then, from the back of the room, a new hand went up. The professor looked up, slightly surprised. The man who had been sitting silently the entire class had finally decided to speak. "Yes, go ahead," the professor said. The room fell quiet. The man's voice was calm, measured. "You mentioned that deep space propulsion is limited by current energy sources," he said. "But what if the problem isn't the energy itself, but how we think about using it?" The professor frowned slightly, intrigued. "What do you mean?" The man leaned forward just a bit. "Take nuclear thermal propulsion, for example. It's been studied for decades, but no one has figured out how to make it viable for long-distance travel. What if the issue isn't with the technology, but with how we approach its scalability? What if we're thinking too small?" A murmur spread through the room. The professor hesitated. This wasn't a typical question. It wasn't just technical. It was challenging the very foundation of space travel strategies. The students turned to see who had asked it. Some had already pulled out their phones, searching for a name, a clue. The professor took a breath and adjusted his glasses. "That's an interesting point," he admitted. "But even if scalability is the issue, no current model successfully overcomes the heat dissipation problem. The risks outweigh the benefits." The man nodded slightly. "Only if you assume traditional cooling methods," he replied. "But what if you designed a reactor with an integrated heat exchange system that functioned in deep space vacuum conditions?" Silence. The professor blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. This wasn't just an advanced question, it was the kind of question that came from someone who had already been working on the solution. One student finally whispered, "Wait, is that?" Another gasped, checking their phone. The realization was spreading. The professor, still processing the question, finally spoke. That is a fascinating perspective." His voice had changed. He was no longer talking to just another student. Because by now, everyone in that room knew, this wasn't just some random person. This was Elon Musk. A wave of murmurs spread through the lecture hall. Students exchanged glances, whispering to each other, eyes wide with shock. The professor, still caught in thought, finally looked up at the man in the back. His curiosity had shifted into something else: recognition. "Who are you?" the professor asked. The room went silent. Everyone waiting for an answer. The man leaned back slightly in his chair. He hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to say it outright. Then, with a small smile, he finally spoke. "My name is Elon," he said. Gasps filled the room. Some students immediately pulled out their phones. A few checked his face against pictures online. Others just stared, their minds racing. "Elon Musk," one student whispered. The professor's eyes widened. He had spent years teaching advanced engineering and space exploration. He had studied the latest developments in propulsion technology. He had even referenced Tesla and SpaceX in his lectures. And now, the man who had built those companies was sitting in his class. The professor took a deep breath. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting that," he said, trying to compose himself. Musk gave a small shrug. I wanted to sit in on a lecture, he said. See what the next generation of engineers is learning. The students were still stunned. Some were frantically taking notes, not on the lecture, but on this moment. One student finally spoke up. Wait, so, you've been here the whole time? Musk nodded. Yeah. Just listening. Another student raised a hand, but this time it wasn't to ask the professor a question, it was for Musk. So, what do you think? Musk looked thoughtful. The lecture is great, he said. But I think there's a bigger opportunity here. The professor, still recovering from the shock, cleared his throat. And what opportunity is that? Musk glanced at the whiteboard, still covered in equations and theories about propulsion systems. He tapped his fingers against his desk. I think we need to stop assuming deep space travel is limited by today's technology, he said. The real question isn't whether it's possible, it's whether we're asking the right questions. The professor nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had spent his entire career researching these concepts. And now, in just a few sentences, Elon Musk had reframed the entire discussion. Students leaned forward, fully engaged. Some were already typing notes, not just about propulsion, but about how to think differently. At that moment, the room wasn't just a lecture hall anymore. It had become something else, a space for new ideas, for possibilities that hadn't been considered before. And it all started with one unexpected question from an unexpected guest. The energy in the lecture hall had completely shifted. Just minutes ago, it was an ordinary class, a routine lecture on space propulsion. Now, students were on the edge of their seats, hanging on to every word. Phones were out, not to check social media, but to capture the moment. Some students whispered in disbelief. Others just sat there staring, processing what had just happened. Elon Musk, one of the most influential minds in technology, had been sitting among them this entire time. And now, he was discussing deep space propulsion like it was a casual conversation. The professor, still slightly stunned, adjusted his glasses. Well, since you're here, he said, trying to gather his thoughts. I have to ask, what do you think is the biggest mistake we're making when it comes to space travel? Musk paused for a moment. Then, he leaned forward. Thinking too small, he said simply. The room was dead silent. Musk continued, his voice calm but firm. People assume Mars is the goal, but that's just step one. If we only focus on getting there, we're limiting ourselves. The real challenge isn't reaching another planet, it's building a system that makes space travel as normal as air travel. The professor nodded slowly. It was a perspective that few had considered. Students started asking questions, real questions, not just about theories but about the future. Do you think we'll see interstellar travel in our lifetime? One student asked. Musk smirked. Depends on how fast we stop debating and start building. Another student raised a hand. What's the hardest part of making rockets more efficient? Musk thought for a second. Heat dissipation, but also people underestimating how much can be improved with better materials and AI-driven optimizations. The conversation kept going. More hands went up. More ideas flowed. The professor had completely stepped back now, watching the discussion unfold. This wasn't his lecture anymore, it was something far bigger. Finally, after what felt like only minutes, but had actually been nearly an hour, Musk checked his watch. I should probably head out, he said. I have a meeting. A few students laughed. The reality of the moment started to settle in. This had really happened. As Musk stood up, students clapped. Some even cheered. The professor shook his head with a smile. Well, I can safely say this is the most memorable lecture I've ever had. Musk gave a small nod. Keep asking the big questions, he said. And with that, he walked out of the lecture hall, leaving behind a room full of students who would never forget the day Elon Musk showed up to their class and changed the way they thought forever.